Welcome to another episode of The Impact of AI, sponsored by AI Time Journal and supported by WLDA, Women Leaders in Data and Artificial Intelligence. Each week, we explore how AI and cognitive technologies impact us daily, both professionally and personally. For those of you whom I've not met, my name is Melissa Drew, and I will be your host for this week's podcast. This week, we are delighted and shocked that we were able to find time on your calendar. Dr. Besa Bauta, she's the Chief Data Officer for Mercy First, and she has responsibility for data structure, data integrity, data governance, including data privacy laws and regulations. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Melissa.
Oh, this is going to be so great. Thank you again for your time. I know
Absolutely.
you're really busy. You seem to have a lot of jobs and a lot of roles, and I think there's a lot of more titles into your role that I didn't even hit on. So before we begin, let's talk about your journey. Everyone's path to where they are has never been a straight path, particularly within the data science and the data and the analytics field. So how did you get to where you are today?
It's a long journey. It's, as you mentioned, everybody's journey is slightly different regarding how they end up in these roles.
Mhm.
So in my undergraduate studies, I was actually in electrical engineering. I completed, coursework in biomedical engineering. I was thinking I'm just going to go directly into the engineering field, but that's where I got exposed into, and I was really good in advanced mathematics and statistics. But I was also interested in the human aspect, the health aspect of using information to improve health. And that kind of was ingrained earlier on. I grew up in Macedonia and Eastern Europe. And I grew up under sort of like a communist regime, during that time. But my background, including my family, has always been in math and science. So sort of, a natural path as far as where I was going to end up, sprinkled with the human aspect of it as far as, health and well-being. During my third year at Rutgers, in Eastern Europe, there was a war. And what ended up happening is that my focus from just the engineering kind of shifted more into the human services. And I was more interested in health and well-being and interested in how do I support refugees. So after I graduated from college, right before I graduated from college, I ended up getting recruited by Department of Defense and a few other interpreting organizations to actually go there and provide support. So when ended up being there on the ground and seeing sort of like the human element, it got me interested in, how do you improve in health and well-being for vulnerable populations, especially refugees? What I realized quickly that, in order to make sense of the human condition at scale, that the data, the analytics was really essential in understanding how do you, do the logistics correctly where you have the greatest impact? How can you provide services that are timely and relevant? So I came back and ended up having a colleague of mine that I met abroad. And she got me interested in the social services, the human services sector. I ended up getting a degree in social work, clinical sort of mental health, because that was sort of my area of interest, like how do you improve services there? And then I got another degree in public health, sort of focusing more on epidemiology and population level management. In my second degree, that's where I got into more of the math and the statistics, sort of like what's, data science. Mm-hmm. And I think, even like I said in my undergraduate, pretty interested in that topic. So just ended up, continuing related to that. So what ended up happening is that during my public health education, as I got more into the sort of the data science and using math and stats for population level outcomes, that I got more into the technology as well as using our information. Ended up getting another position in the human services sector and became a data and analytics position. And sort of that's how my journey started, sort of looking at data, looking at healthcare data, looking at social service data, education data, and trying to make sense of that data, putting that data together and getting a good 360 view of that individual client or patient. And trying to figure out, from that moment, what are the key variables? What are the key indicators that are key and essential for program delivery, number one, but what are the key components for risk that need to be identified earlier on? And how do you mitigate that at the individual level, at the group level, and at the larger population level? So that kind of sort of launched my journey into, moving in from a data analyst to a data scientist, and then moving further to sort of managing evaluation, research, and analytics projects at scale. And then from then on, obviously, it was a good marriage between the data and the technology piece. You have to be adept at both understanding the data, the numbers, understanding context, nuance, but also being adept at using the technology that's available to bring those insights. So I think it was both sort of a parallel learning path to where I am today. And that path has kind of continued on. But as you said before, I think the journey, there's always an interest somewhere. And that interest, gets intertwined obviously with life and sort of experiences and what's out there, what's being offered to you. And that, journey, as long as you have a destination like a North Star, and my North Star has always been, how do we improve health and well-being? And then, data was a key component of that part. So marrying both of those things, I think that's how it got me here.
Wow, that's a long journey, and there's a lot of education in there. I was just looking at your LinkedIn site, but I think what I'm hearing from you is that you really had an interest in these parallel paths, and the data component just married those two together, which then led you down and gave you the foundation to become what you are today.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would say to any of my students out there, pursue your interest. The technology is just a tool. The techniques are tools. Whatever is available to you out there are tools. But what's really important is understanding what is it that you're trying to do and trying to accomplish. In my case, obviously, has always been to how do I improve the health and well-being of vulnerable population? And that had to be with my personal experience, sort of looking at refugees, looking at migrants, looking at individuals whose lives were at risk, and thinking about what are those critical services and how do you align them? And the only way to do that properly is to collect the data, analyze the data, and then shift, especially scarce resources to areas that are critically needed to achieve those outcomes. And I tell my students all the time that technology is a tool. You could learn how to code in Python, or, when I, went to undergraduates, it was Fortran, and later on C++. I'm dating myself as far as, the computers that we had were like old Commodores computers. And I thought it was like, wow, this is so amazing. Look at this little box, and I get to write a code and create smiley faces. And I thought that was bee's knees. I'm like, this is so fabulous. But I mean, obviously, when I went to college and now technology has advanced so much, and it's going to continue to advance. And obviously what my kids and the next generation are using, what they have in their hands and their smartphones is 10 times or maybe even 1,000 times, faster and much smarter than what I was using in college. But I saw it as a tool, and I, keep telling the generations, yes, this is a tool that, obviously it's much more sophisticated. It can do much more. It's how you use it that is the key. And that's the, essential component.
So I want to take everything that you just said, and I want to shift it over to your role at Mercy First, because what I didn't say in your bio when I did your introduction is that you hold 3 roles. You have the Chief Data Officer, the Chief Compliance Officer, and the Information Privacy Officer at Mercy First. Is that correct?
That's correct. I get the, 3 titles for the price of 1.
Yeah. So I will say that I've seen it more common to have a Chief Data Officer, Chief Analytics Officer, or a Chief Data and Analytics Officer. But I haven't seen this kind of combination before. So I'm really interested in understanding, how did all of those 3 get woven into your role?
So before I came to my position, there was a lawyer actually that had that position. He left, and hence his tasks kind of got transferred over to me as the chief compliance officer role. And obviously, there was also the analytics, the data, the evaluation components that needed. That's what I got hired for. And I remember the human resources person sort of, I'm like, I got hired for the evaluation, I got hired for the data science, I got hired for this part. And I didn't really think I was getting hired for the other part. And I remember the human resources person saying, "Oh, by the way, you're also our chief compliance officer and welcome on board." And I'm like, what what did I just sign on? I guess I didn't read the second part of the job description where it's like, by the way, you're also these other things. So that's how I ended up getting both of the roles, the analytics part and, the compliance piece, both kind of, married together. It's definitely an interesting sort of, combination in a lot of ways. Before I think about, can I do this? And I'm like, is this ethically viable? Is this ethically feasible? Is this doable? Are we going to get into any issues related to compliance or Office of Medicaid Inspector General? So that's always at the back of my mind. So a lot of my projects they have a different reevaluations as far as, should this go forward? Because I have to wear that compliance hat at the same time. So it makes things very interesting when you kind of are in the dual position. There's nobody else that tells me, no, you cannot do this. I have to have self-control and say, I cannot do this. It's almost sort of like having those donuts in front of you and you really want to eat those donuts, but you shouldn't. And then the other voice in your head says, no, do not touch those donuts because it's really not good for your health. But the other side of you says, oh my God, look, if I have all these donuts, I could do whatever I want with them, reorganize those donuts. But my other side says, no, don't touch the sugar. So that's kind of hard to do, especially if they're really great donuts that you definitely want to touch them. But on the other side, you have to tread lightly as far as maybe you have one or two donuts rather than having the whole box. I mean, that's just an analogy as far as sort of, being in that dual role of trying to think about, what projects can you implement, but then what are the ethical considerations on the other side? And then for me, what I haven't lost sight at the end is our children and families that are receiving services, the most vulnerable populations, the most marginalized. So for me is that I want to ensure that those individuals and families get the best services that we can provide and done in an ethical way, that you don't want to compromise their safety, you don't want to compromise their well-being, you don't want to compromise their information or their privacy. I think all of those things are really critically important.
So let me step back and ask you a little bit more about, I understand where your goals are with your role. Where are you and Mercy First within that AI journey? So when you began early on, it was at the very early stages. You were there building that group, that department, that role, that culture. But you've been there for over 4 years now. So yeah, where are you within that journey, and where do you need to go?
So I think it's sort of like a lot of organization is stop and go. We put our toe into the AI, sort of world. In our initial project 2 years ago was developing natural language process application to sort of sift through large scale, electronic health record data. And the goal of that process was to unearth insights for our clinicians and our physicians and make those insights actionable. So, I mean, I had a concept related to, how do you combine information that's really unique where you're combining them from multiple sources to have a 360 view. But that 360 view also include the social determinants of health of the individuals and families that we serve. And the algorithm and model had to surface both the safety and the risk based on the social determinants of the health framework. Our initial concept did really well. We won the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, award. They thought this is like, right on target as far as how do you, support vulnerable populations. And then the same concept we applied to the NYU challenge grant. So when we're finalists in the challenge grant, we got beat up by another individual, but but for me, it was basically the proof of concept was there. And have we implemented this fully within our organization? No. And what usually happens within a lot of different organizations is that they have the AI analytics teams and they have their little sandbox environment. They're developing a lot of these, applications, but sometimes a lot of these applications don't get fed into the organization or become part of that process. So for us is that developing those proof of concepts, developing the algorithms, check. I think is sort of implementing them into practice. That's the next step of development that we haven't gone there yet.
So then what is next? Like if you're, it sounds like you're still in that moving out of the proof of concept so that it's more scalable for the rest of the organization?
Exactly correct.
Okay.
That's where we are.
What do you see as your next project to help you scale into the rest of the organization?
I think as far as the next project, and this is not just within our organization, but also across the Human Services Network, is to take this proof of concept. I think what for us, in order to sort of implement this, at scale, we ran into legal issues. And one of the issues was that if this algorithm surfaces a decision, while that augments the decision of the physician or the clinician or whoever is providing the services. So it's sort of trusting, that algorithms, feedback regarding, safety and risk based on the way it was developed. So for us is validating those algorithms as a next step. And then, working with our constituents and our partners to sort of implement this within the organization and have that become part of process of a tool that gets used on a daily basis.
You mentioned something really interesting, and I don't think I caught this until I recognized that we're really talking about healthcare. But when I look at other organizations, when the validation of the algorithms, they're not looking at it, I think, at the same perspective you are. So your data is impacting how individuals today could be making their decisions around another individual versus some of the other organizations I talk to, they're validating their data around, financial data and, humans coming in and looking at the data and making the context to be a more decision-based organization. There's a much more unique challenge that I think you really just articulated within healthcare that I don't think that we've really thought about yet.
I agree. And I think that when you develop these algorithms or tools and you implement them into practice, is supposed to be an adjunctive tool to the physicians or the clinicians. Mm-hmm. It's not there to replace their clinical decision-making. It's supposed to augment their clinical decision-making. And it's very different if I get a recommender engine from Netflix, right? The risk there is pretty low if I'm going to like this movie versus that movie based on my likes and preferences. Mm-hmm. It's a whole other ball game if the algorithm surfaces something, let's say it's a diagnostic for cancer and misses something or identifies something and you're providing treatment that might not be necessary. That's a false positive versus a false negative where basically disease is present, but it doesn't show up in the algorithm. The other way is false positive where a disease might not be present, but you're treating for something that's not there. Mm-hmm. You're providing chemotherapy for somebody that doesn't have that. That's very unlikely because most of these algorithms have pretty high precision rates anyway. And there's, within healthcare, there's triplicate reviews before anything goes into scale or into practice. But I think one of the important points that you raised, Melissa, is that it's really different to think about sort of level of risk by different industries. So, right. Like obviously if somebody's developed, like for example, currently during our pandemic, if, Pfizer or Moderna is developing sort of, vaccines and they're, putting in algorithms at scale that look at the efficacy of these vaccines, obviously you want to make sure that you get those correct. As far as would a potential change in the vaccine actually increase or decrease rates of, immunization acceptance, whatever it is that, you're studying. But in those cases, I think you have to become much more precise and your error rates have to be much lower because obviously, the impact is greater, and potential for lawsuits are also greater as well, I think. So it's always on the air of, and safety and precaution. And, if you're going to implement any sort of those applications.
So when you and your team are developing, going from concept to prototype, and it sounds like your end-to-end life cycle would have a much longer life cycle because of the potential risk that your data would have as far as augmenting that human.
Absolutely. I think in
Okay.
healthcare, you see, like randomized controlled trials can last decades. And then, I mean, it's unprecedented to see like this Moderna vaccine, get developed in such a short time. But actually, the testing for a lot of these vaccines have been in development for actually 20 or more years. So this is nothing new. Hence, that's why we're able to, ramp up and, get a vaccine, which is pretty unique. But for a lot of, healthcare, or, it takes a lot, the lifespan is much longer for development than it would be in other sectors like finance, or maybe marketing or advertising, wherever it is. That because of the safety at risk, there's different protocols. And obviously you have to also abide by city, state, and federal protocols and other protocols related to the safety and efficacy, whatever you're going to be doing. So it's definitely a more of a compliance mindset. In a way, I think it works even for me, sort of being this dual role, that compliance mindset as far as information privacy, information security, and the use of this information. I think it's, at the foremost regarding any sort of application development and use.
So you must have a really strong team behind you.
I have an amazing team.
Yeah, I know everybody. Yes, that's wonderful. No, that's great. So what kind of team structure do you have to support this? Do you have a group of just focused data people, and then another group of people that can really articulate and communicate, the context of the data? How is your team structured?
So I have few really strong data people. I have individuals that can articulate, and sometimes, finding that unicorn that has both. I have one or two of those individuals. I mean, that is key, to have the right team and have the right team with the right expertise, because obviously, you're not going to be able to do everything on your own, but also relying on colleagues across, the business units, relying, colleagues in the information technology. We're separate from information technology, but you cannot do this work alone, and it's all the components are intertwined. So the most important thing, what I see, is that the ability to work together across different divisions to accomplish a goal. And that's unique. So you could have the amazing analysts, the most amazing, data engineers, your data scientists, but if they're not able to understand the business, if they're not able to work collaboratively across to, achieve a goal, then it's almost impossible, all for naught.
I recently had a conversation with someone who's hiring. She's also a chief data analytics officer, and she's hiring. And she said her primary role that she's looking for, the skill sets within that role, is collaboration, communication, the soft skills, things that I can teach you Python. I can teach you to come in here and create a model. But what I really want is someone that could at least communicate what their model does, or at least be able to communicate to our review committee what the assumptions were in that model. So I thought that was a very interesting, and I'm starting to see that that's becoming a much more relevant topic, is around the talent and the skills that we're trying to get into our groups.
Absolutely. Sometimes, as you mentioned, you could learn those skills. I could teach you programming. I could teach you, all those technical components, but I can't teach you those soft skills to be a really great human being, just to be honest, ethical, genuine, all of those components. And sometimes I think those end up being much more important, and a lot of other projects now are team-based. So it really has to be in a collaborative environment where you're going to be working together in a non-judgmental, viewpoint, where, you have an open mind related to a problem, and, being open to seeing things in a very, different way, and being open to also receive feedback. in a more light-hearted way to say, okay, maybe this is not working because of, let me entertain this, perspective or that perspective. And I hate, looking outside the box or inside the box. I don't like boxes at all. It's just having that information share and flow that is going to, allow for that critical thinking as far as projects. I think that's really absolutely critical and important.
Do you have one or two questions that you typically ask in an interview?
I usually ask, how do you work? How do you get along with, your friends, your family, your colleagues, sort of the getting along part?
Mhm.
And also, what are some of the challenges as far as, when you run into teams or what I consider difficult individuals sometimes, is that how do you, work with that individual? What have you tried? Because every single person, I think even in your podcast and otherwise, will end up hitting or working with somebody that tends to be what is considered not that easy to work with.
Mhm.
So how do you empathize with that individual? How can you solve their problems in a way that actually meets their needs? How can you work collaboratively when there is multiple barriers? How can you critically problem solve in those situations? And keep a level head and don't get frustrated. All of those things are really hard to do, especially when we're human. We're subject to, get frustrated when, somebody tells us, things are not working well, or I don't like what you're doing, becomes very personal and you take it personally and become very negative. So I think in those cases, it's really important to sort of have a holistic understanding what else can be going on. And, think about all of this in a larger paradigm rather than just sort of, the way we operate in our own little universe.
Those are all good lessons learned. Good for anyone who's going through the interview process, specifically those rising stars in data science. They're out there looking for jobs. So thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to shift to something that I heard you speak probably several months ago. But one of the things that you talked about was when you go into a company and you look first at the systems of where the data is stored. And oftentimes they're stored in silos and they're stored in multiple areas. And you made a reference that, some people have noted just tear everything down and pull them all together. And your comment was interesting because you said, well, the silos are sometimes there for a reason. And instead of tearing everything down, why don't we just build bridges and pull the data we need into a larger area? Do you recall that conversation?
Yeah. Oh my God, Melissa. You've done your homework.
I did, yeah.
I don't remember what I did yesterday. No,
No.
I do remember. It's like we're in this COVID pandemic universe where, just information and we're all Zooming 24/7.
Yeah.
I think what I was trying to say there is that sometimes, as any new leader that comes into an organization, you're going to target on things that are not working. This is not working. That is not working. That's the reason you're brought in, right? If you're being interviewed, that the reason you're coming in is to solve a pain point. And it's really critical to think about what that pain point is, but also have to take an account organizationally and historically, why was it set up that way? There must have been an underlying reason why that was set up that way, either because the technology didn't exist where we could just, group everything together now, or there was another reason, privacy, security, or a personal reason because somebody wanted to have full control of, that domain or that business area. It could be all three. So for the leader is sort of to deconstruct and de-identify what were the underlying reasons for that setup. Why is this organization structured this way? What is the information resources? Why are the information resources structured the way they are? What does the technology development look like from, as I mentioned, from a Commodore to a really cool smartphone, does it exist in the legacy system because it worked? And sometimes I say, if it's working, why temper with it? You could do enhancements with it, but sometimes I think we put too many resources where they shouldn't be. And sometimes I think it's better to sort of divert those resources in something that is doable, a quick win. If you could solve a problem with the least amount of effort, go there. I mean, unless the house is completely, in disarray and your foundation is completely crumbling and, you have a termite problem, then yeah, I say, yeah, go ahead, restructure the whole thing from the beginning. But if it's just a minor adjustment, if your window is leaking, then just fix the window leak. Like, why are you touching everything else when everything else is fine? So that's just an analogy. When I say building bridges, is sort of looking for the least common denominator as far as how can you improve a process or a service or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with the least amount of resources and time, and getting that ROI pretty quickly, and then sort of building, monumentally across time and across projects to get to your final goal. It's almost what's considered sort of the agile development, or some of these, processes that are really, exciting and new right now. But I've always kind of, had that philosophy of sort of building small and building, via different projects.
So what did you do at your role? Did you did you have a new container, like a data warehouse, a data lake, or a lake house, or did you build something proprietary? What did you do at Mercy First?
So we did have, I mean, we built a data lake,
Okay.
and try to pull in data from different types of sources. But sometimes for us, what we realized is that our existing data system needed to be updated. So instead of, and what we realized is that when we were grouping a lot of this information, you get errors at a higher rate because we didn't have the foundational components, set correctly. So for us, this was to look at the existing systems, to relook at the structures and reevaluate what can be accomplished by updating those structures and processes. So that ended up, we went directly with a data lake, with a modern architecture, doing all of that amazing stuff. But we realized that some of the foundational components were missing. Data literacy was missing. The way the information was coming in wasn't clean. That kind of at the aggregate level, obviously, whatever model you're running, if it's not clean, coming in, you're going to have obviously issues upstream. So for us was sort of, going back and looking at the existing systems, looking at the existing EHRs, looking at the legacy systems, and doing a lot of that cleanup downstream in order for us to have the analytics upstream.
No, that's really good. I absolutely, my role in AI and cognitive technologies has always been the earlier stages. Where's the data coming from? How are we going to harmonize that data? How do we create commonality with that data, but also making sure that the data is clean? And it's always they keep saying dirty data in, dirty data out, but I don't think people really understand that just because I have AI technologies and I'm going to run some really cool models and I'm going to do really good things, you still have the back end pieces, those foundational elements. And I think a lot of people keep forgetting that part. So that's awesome.
And your models might not reflect what you want them to reflect because you're not collecting the right information, or the information is not clean. Therefore, the margins of error are much greater. There could be multiple different reasons why the model is not being operationalized the way it should, or doesn't give you the feedback that it should. As you said, Melissa, if you don't have those foundational components, I think, no matter what awesome models and data engineers you come up with, that you cannot put those models into productions, because obviously your inherent problem is the basic problem of your information and harmonization of your information.
So you've been in the healthcare and the data science field for a long time, even though back then in 2004 they didn't call it data science back then, but that's what we were all doing in 2004. So when we look at the healthcare trends, what healthcare trends do you see that you feel like there's some emphasis there that it's going to come into reality? It's not just going to be a trend, versus on the other hand, what are some things that you're seeing where, yeah, I think it's just going to fall apart. It's probably not going to go anywhere. I'm curious to get your insights on that.
I actually have been thinking about this, as far as where is the next, step in the healthcare, sector. I think hyper personalization having products that are personalized to me specifically and personalized to the individual. So they're personalized to Melissa, they're personalized to Besa. They're not just personalized to a generic person that's, my age, shall not be named or not disclosed. In a lot of ways, I think that's where the healthcare field is moving. And this is definitely from what we see in the other sectors, for marketing, advertising, and others like the Amazons and the Microsofts. What I'm seeing is that much more personalization to the individual, including getting emails that are targeted to you, targeted to your likes, targeted to what you have purchased, targeted to what you want to purchase. And in a way, especially my kids, they use TikTok all the time. And then the algorithms, the more they use, they're becoming much more personalized to their likes and their interests. I mean, that's a two-way sword, because in a way, you don't know what you're being exposed to, or the other part of the world, because you're not being exposed to that. It's being targeted to you. So in a way, you're being narrowed to your likes rather than to things that you don't like. So there's also the danger of that. But I see that even in healthcare, that, if I have a certain condition, if I'm a diabetic, or, if I have mental health issues or whatever, that I'm going to get personalized care that actually is wrapped around my risks and targets those risks, including, genomic risks. So, my, heredity, what my grandparents have given me or parents, as well as, sort of other risks, environmental risks, the communities I live in. And so you could have environmental risks there. And then social behavioral risks that, you engage in if you're a smoker, if you're, out in public, especially now, if you're not, following certain protocols, whatever it may be, that that treatment, that intervention will be much more personalized to the user. And I see that, continuing in multiple different fields across the board.
And a trend that maybe we're not sure it's going to get off.
So the healthcare thing recently had, they're focusing sort of like this, creating synthetic patients and identifying, developing models where you have, a common data set, and then based on that common data set, you come up with a proxy individual that, you could test interventions. I think, sometimes that had to do with a lot of the privacy laws and regulations. But what we're seeing now is that a lot of the organizations and healthcare and others are using their own data set to tailor services to their populations and do that close one-on-one matching, whatever service they're providing. So if it's a mental health care organization, you have a lot of these, online applications, like Headspace and others. So they're going to be using a lot of their data to tailor those services much closely to the individuals that are subscribing to that service. I don't think, usually in marketing advertising, you end up buying data externally, but I don't see that in healthcare. I think more organizations will be mining their own data and using their own data, in a very different way.
Okay, so I recently interviewed somebody and I asked them where are they collecting their data from, internal, external. The answer was both. And then at one point we hit on a number of over 130,000 different data sets that were being pulled in, both internally and externally. So no, I think that's a really good point, because so far everything that I've heard, we're pulling data from anywhere we possibly can to create a much more, what some people have called a much more robust or a much more comprehensive view of that individual. But in healthcare, it sounds like it's going to be data that's created within the healthcare field, not external data that's coming from another.
I mean, you're going to use your internal data, but I also think that, for example, let's say use Headspace or some other mental health, I would be interested in your other social determinants of health data, because your mental health is determined by many other factors. So if there's publicly available data sets, for example, from the CDC or others, or even, Google BigQuery regarding where the individual lives, I definitely want that data, or that data might be valuable to them, because obviously the reason that you're having high stress is because you live in a community that has high crime, or the services, there may be either, lack of resources within the community to provide services for you. So you have to travel a longer distance if you're living in a rural versus urban area. So I think that type of information is going to be really key to sort of have a better view of that individual and what might be some of those stressors that individual experiences, and how do you mitigate that, stressors. For if I'm living in a rural area, then my mental health intervention would be much more focused in dealing with environmental related conditions or other conditions. If it's social relational conditions, then that intervention will be very different related to how do I develop their treatment plan for that individual. So I think it's both. I think that using the information that you have, mining that in a very different way, but also looking outside, what other information can be acquired to have a better perspective of that patient.
I could see that. It goes back to, if we want a full 360-degree view, we need as much data as we possibly can. And a lot of these other companies are pulling data within their specific areas. So being able to pull that in to give you different perspectives of the individual.
I think what's really important, if you're going to be pulling, like you said, 130 different data sources, are you pulling the right information? Because I always look at it as a cost benefit analysis, right? Mm-hmm. Do all of these data sets give you the critical information that you need to develop a product or provide a service? If they're not giving you critical information, then what value or use does that data have? Data for data's sake, I'm like, great, you're pulling this, but is it helping you achieve a goal? Is it helping you achieve an outcome? Is it helping make the model better? Is it helping you make the service better? If it is, then great. But if it's not, then I think, organizations have to be much more strategic to look at their data assets and say, okay, we have all of these data assets. Which ones are critical for us to sort of use and focus and concentrate to make them as much more usable, feasible, timely, relevant, actionable, spend our time, energy, and resources to make this, data set as usable, as equitable as possible. So then whatever product that we're creating is going to be generalizable, not only to our population, but then we can make it specific to our individuals that we're trying to impact.
I'm laughing because I'm remembering a story. I'm sitting down with an individual, a group of folks, and part of my role is we need to go through and make sure that the data you're collecting is meaningful. And you hit it exactly, because I literally would go through field by field. So what's in this field? Great. What's the data that's being collected in this field? Are you using this data? And the answer is always, well, we must be, because we're collecting it. Well, what are you going to use the data for? Is it answering a question? Are you making a decision? So we go through the top 5 things. And if they say no to every one of them, we're like, then we don't need to collect it. We don't need it. But and they're like, it's like but we're collecting it for some reason. But if you guys aren't going to use it, then we don't need it, and let's get it out. So yeah, I go through those a lot, and I think the challenge is that people have been collecting data for so long because it was the thing to do, that they forgot that they're supposed to be collecting data to make better informed decisions, to create actionable results. So yeah, you articulated it perfectly. Yeah.
Sort of like my kids say, it's FOMO, fear of missing out, and fear of what you don't know. And and I think a lot of the organizations have to look at what is it that they have, and you, exactly as you mentioned, go line by line and look at all this information. How is this being used? And a lot of time, all this energy, time, and resources are being spent to collect it, but nothing is being, that information is not being used. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like, if I buy this blouse and maybe in the future I'll wear it, but if my weight loss plan goes really well, then I will. And it's sort of that kind of mindset. When I realize that I'll never wear that sweater because I'll never be at that, weight or whatever. That's just an analogy, but sort of, having these pieces of information that are not as relevant as some others. And then in a way, you're spreading yourself thin because you're not focusing on the critical components that you need. And maybe your business has changed, your business model has changed. So you have to go back and say, okay, we collected this information because it served a purpose back then, Does it serve a purpose now? And are we missing something? Should we collect something else or in addition to, or do we need to change the way we're collecting, information? What would give us the important insights? And that's kind of harder to do, especially with existing processes. And habits are hard to change in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
individually and organizationally.
So I use the closet analogy, just like you did. I was like, oh my God, we use the same analogy. I use the closet analogy, but I tell everybody that there are studies out there that say now with the changes in technology, with the constant changes in our global economy and the consistent and the continual changes of our consumer demand, your organization will be changing every 2 years. The purpose of your organization or where you need to steer that ship changes every 2 years. And so I use the closet analogy that every 2 years you need to be going through your closet because what you're wearing today isn't what you wore 2 years ago. But that's so funny because everybody, I think, recognizes the closet. It's such a relevant, it's easy to understand. Yeah, I love it. That's
and
funny.
You hold on to that sweater. You're like, I was a size 2 10 years ago. I shall be back at this. And you will never, because obviously styles change, times change. And that's really great because you have to think about your data as sort of what you have available in your closet and cleaning it out, getting rid of the old and sort of making space for new, new things, new ways of thinking, and also being reactive and nimble to the market and thinking about what does the market look like? What are the consumer demands and how do we meet them? And doing that is really difficult, organizationally.
Unfortunately, our time is coming to a close, but I'd love for you to at least one more question. What is some good lessons learned? Because you've been there for the last almost 4.5 years, building out something from concept to prototype to reality to scaling. If I was going to join a company today and I'm where you were 4 years ago, what advice would you give me? What are some lessons learned to help me out?
Having an open mind, being flexible, I think it's always really important. And you're going to hit roadblocks and challenges. So another really important component is building relationships across the organization, because without that knowledge and expertise, especially institutional knowledge of how things were and how things need to be, it's really hard to move forward into the future. So and partnering with those business, partners, technology partners, other partners, and helping them guide you in your decision making, I think it's key. You're not going to know everything. And it's really important to partner with those individuals and work alongside with them to create something that's going to be sustainable. Because obviously, whatever you're creating, whatever model, whatever service, you want to ensure that it goes into production, it gets used. I mean, the last thing you want to do is spend all that time and energy and have a product that just goes on a shelf and nobody uses it. And then being open to sort of realizing where your blind spots are, which is really hard to do, and sort of taking that into stride and saying, okay, maybe I overlooked this. It's something that I need to readdress, and being open to change, which is really hard to do.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you again for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
This was fun. The donut and the clothes analogies aside.
I love it. I'm going to remember that. Yep. All right.
Thank you, Melissa, so much.
Sure thing.